Well, welcome to the regenBC conference. We come to you from our many homes, our farms, our farm offices, our offices, from Souk to I'm not even sure where, but we're all over the province. And it's not costing any of us a dime, which is really cool. So BC is an incredibly diverse province, and this is an opportunity for everyone, anywhere, to join in. So welcome. My name is Jennifer Dyson. I farm and reside in the home of the Hupachasat and Sishat people in the Alberni Valley. And I'm also the chair of the Agricultural Land Commission. And I'm your host for this first evening of regenBC. So before we get started, just one little housekeeping note. Make sure that your speakers are working. If I'm doing, then your speakers are not working. So just go to the chat room for any instructions and they can help you with those things. So our first speaker, I'm absolutely honored to introduce Chief Patrick Michel. And for those who don't know, and Chief Patrick, I will say it again, I am very sorry to hear of the loss of your home from the devastating fires in Lytton this summer. And it hurts so many, this incredible force of nature this summer. Chief Michel will give us a traditional opening of the conference, but let me introduce Chief Michel first. Chief Patrick Michel is from the Kanaka Bar Indian Band, the First Nation between the towns of Boston Bar and Lytton, and has spent his whole life in the gorgeous Fraser Canyon, working with his community to establish air, water, food, shelter, and shelter certainty for the environment and the economy of today, and more importantly, for tomorrow. Chief Patrick, I hand it over to you for the traditional opening.
Aquat loshik shnukat. Cook be kana hans questions akatmo klaktenmo. Ask cook p cook steb to mu cook steb in Wabaten. It's a simple opening where I've just said, thanks Jennifer for the opening. My name is Chief Patrick Michel from the Kanaka Bar Indian Band, and we're very blessed to be in this incredible province we call British Columbia, because Tamu is land. And in Wabaten is the resources that the land produces. And I've broken it into 4 ecosystems here at Kanaka. It's basically the winged ones, the finned ones, the root people, and the 4-leggeds. And for 8,000 years, Ntlakatmu people basically lived off the land and resources sustainably. And as you mentioned, on June 30th, 2021, an extreme weather event, a combination of air, drought, and heat, produced circumstances that saw the complete loss of a municipality. The village of Lytton is gone, and over 1,240 people are still in the wind. But when we look at the concept of air, water, food, in that order, these are physiological foundations. The fact that we're here, 400 plus participants here to talk about resiliency and sustainability in food. This is the time. The smartest people I know are in this room. I've had the pleasure of seeing Dr. Weaver a few times at the Clean Energy BC conferences. Yeah. Our community reversed the adverse effects of colonization through the renewable energy sector. And we take all the funds from that participation and reinvest it. We now have 12 operating solar projects. We're investing in SIA. For those people who don't know it, it's called Controlled Environment Agriculture. So it is agriculture that will be immune to the coldest parts of the winter or the hottest parts of the summer, so that heat, drought, wind will not affect our crops. So we're continuing to expand on the physiological foundations. But I also wanted to say, as part of my introduction, is that British Columbia, all of us everywhere are facing, we have regional diversity, but we're also going to be facing regional climate changes. But as part of all conferences moving forward, and it was a long time coming, we often give land acknowledgements. And so every chance you get when you're at a conference, if you can, thank the nation whose lands you're on. If you have any trouble, I always like to say, go on to Google and pin get to the closest community. And if you're having trouble pronouncing the name of the nation or the community, just get to the closest community, because British Columbia has 203 First Nations, and there's one close to you, and they'll help you with your land acknowledgements. So thank you again, Creative, for this day. You've given us these incredible gifts, and you've also given us this gift of life and the power of choice. And on behalf of myself, my nation, my community, and my family, thank you for choosing to be part of this event today, because that is the greatest gift that the Creator gave us, is choice.
Yeah, Chief Michelle, thank you so much. Now, our next speaker is no stranger, the Honorable Lana Popham. She is the first female Minister of Agriculture, Food and Fisheries, and has been serving as MLA for Saanich South since 2009. She has traveled this province so extensively, I think she knows it more than most people in this province. Meeting with farmers, ranchers, food processors, ag associations, food advocacy groups, municipalities, you name it, they're all welcome at Minister Popham's door. She is a strong advocate for agriculture. She understands agriculture, and more importantly, she understands people. She is here for BC, for food security, for environmental sustainability, and economic development. Lana Popham.
Thank you so much, Chair Dyson. I appreciate that introduction, and I'm grateful for the fact that you're here to join us tonight. Chief Patrick, I love you. I'm so sorry for what your family has gone through, what your area has gone through, and I can't think of anybody who is more fitting to give the traditional opening than you, because you have been an incredibly strong voice as long as I've known you for sustainability and food security and resilience. And so thank you. I'm grateful for the words that you gave us. Welcome to everybody who's here. As Chief Patrick said, we have over 400 people that have registered for this conference, which is absolutely stunning. I am happy to be speaking to you from the traditional territories of the WSÁNEĆ peoples on the Saanich Peninsula in Cordova Bay. It's going to be an awesome 3 nights, and to be able to open up a conference called regenBC is like a dream come true for me. We are going to be able to share ideas on the future of regenerative agriculture and agritech. We want to explore these 2 concepts to see how we can support them by working together to ensure we have the most sustainable, resilient food system that we can in British Columbia. Many of you know, you're no stranger to regenerative agriculture, and you know that it's not a new concept. But when we pair it with the latest technology, like the tech that's being developed here in British Columbia, we can open up a lot more opportunities to help farmers while also strengthening our food system and adding tools to our toolbox as we grapple with climate change effects. This summer gave us an absolute stark reminder of the perils of climate change and what we're facing. It was a very tough season for so many people. We know that it's not going to get easier, and so we have the choice to adapt the best that we can. I'm hopeful that we can start to lay some of the groundwork for that during this conference and figure out what farmers need most and the role that we can play as government to support those needs. We'll share best practices. We're going to find some inspiration and success stories. And also, we're going to find some much needed hope. Last year, the development of the Regenerative Agriculture and Agritech Network was an idea that was floating out there. And it became formal in November when I was given a mandate from the Premier to take on establishing this network. A Regenerative Agriculture and Agritech Network, now known as RAN, is a bit of a mouthful, but the idea behind it is simple. We want to help connect BC farmers to the latest tech so they can improve production, so they can measure their outcomes, so they can measure their successes, hopefully create some efficiencies and become more environmentally sustainable. It's a big goal, but we need to plot the pathway to get there, and that includes everybody who's joined us. I want to launch this conference tonight with a really clear message. The next few days is about hope, but not just hope. It's about action. We want to hear from experts and partners on how we can work together on moving forward and creating a regenerative agriculture network in BC, and that will include an agritech network as well. Regen means a lot of different things to a lot of people. I'm hoping that we can have an open and frank dialogue at this conference about what is working, how we can adopt best practices for our regions. By establishing a network here in BC, it will help ensure that farmers have the support they need to combine new agritech such as machine visioning and mesh networks with regenerative agricultural practices. The Regen approach covers new and existing technologies that aim to restore soils, water, biodiversity health, to improve overall ecosystem services, and to make farmland more resilient to the effects of climate change. At the same time, agritech in support of regenerative agriculture will also help us mitigate climate change by sequestering greenhouse gases and reducing on-farm outputs. The interest is strong from both small and large companies, from small and large farms. As minister, I've had the opportunity to travel around, as Jennifer said, to get to know a lot of different people with a lot of different opinions, and to also listen to what people understand as their opportunity for regenerative agriculture and agritech. A couple weeks ago, I had the chance to visit some companies. I heard about exciting work from businesses like Actera and Lucent Biosciences, what they're doing to aid in building up our soils, to Ecoation and what they're doing to take care of crops, minimize the impacts of pests and disease. I learned from Valid Manufacturing, a company up in Salmon Arm, what they're doing. They're working closely with the dairy industry to maximize the benefits of waste and reduce environmental impacts of that industry. And these companies are just a few. We have 150 tech companies operating in British Columbia. The regenBC Agriculture and Agritech Conference is all about connecting farmers and producers to new technology. BC has an incredible agritech sector, and we want to build on the momentum to ensure that we have real benefits to our BC food system. There is no question that we're going to continue to ensure the preservation of critical growing areas in BC. We have incredible agricultural land, but we can also support food processing and agritech businesses to make sure we're looking at a regional model to support our province. This will be crucial, not only to ensuring real food security, but also lasting prosperity, making sure we've got good jobs, especially as we work towards a recovery following the pandemic that we're living through now. BC agriculture and food production needs to take its place in a solution to the climate crisis, and the time to do that is now. I'm so excited that this day has finally arrived. regenBC is rolling, and we're officially underway, and I just am so grateful that you're all taking part in it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Minister Popham. That was a fantastic opening, as usual. And I just want to, I'll spend a couple of minutes before I go to our incredible keynote presenter. But among the challenges and uncertainties, few matters are more immediate or more important than food. And this pandemic has certainly raised the profile of local agriculture. But early on, it also zeroed in on some of the weaknesses that exist, the complex supply networks where agricultural products pass through many hands. So much consolidation and processing over 20 years within this province. A few very large corporations exist that own key links to those networks. So the wake up is how dangerously fragile those those consolidations were and are. But the good news is that BC is an incredibly diverse province, and that diversity also extends to the commodities. I always remember a deputy minister who had said, many provinces in this country only have to deal with 5 commodities. Our Minister of Agriculture deals with over 200. So it's incredible, and we need to celebrate that amazing diversity. But it is as diverse as the geography of this province. And we are innovators, and agriculture is once again very much front and center. Our farms and ranches have always had to adapt. And in doing so, we build resilience. And there are many hands and minds willing to help and think our way forward, as in the case of this regenBC conference. So this is an amazing start. Overall, resilience is the diversity of how we farm, but it is in viability. If we're not viable, it's hard to be resilient. The viability also comes in our seeds, our crops, our livestock, our land use, our water management, our water use, our farm practices. So this is a tremendous opportunity in getting folks to the table and bringing those points of view forward. And I know it's going to be as varied as our geography. The Agricultural Land Reserve is a zone for agriculture, and this zone has played a huge role in sustaining economic and social benefits that have accrued from agriculture in every single region of this province. In BC, we've got a really small amount of land, but we're all vying for those valley bottoms where communities need to continue to grow. And as the pandemic hit, we were all innovating and improvising like never before. So to have more tools in our toolbox, like innovation and technology that frees up time, increases profits, to aid in soil fertility, or to measure the results, are some of the examples that we're going to hear about. This helps agriculture continue to grow and be powerful, and to continue to be a powerful economic driver now and for future generations. It is my great pleasure now to introduce Dr. Andrew Weaver as our keynote presenter. Dr. Weaver is a professor in the School of Earth and Ocean Sciences at the University of Victoria, and previously held the Canada Research Chair in Climate Modeling and Analysis. He was elected to the BC Green Party as MLA and leader in 2013, representing the riding of Oak Bay Gordon Head. And for his work developing British Columbia's Clean BC economic plan collaboratively with the BC NDP, he and the Minister of Environment, George Heyman, both received the 2020 Clean 16 and Clean 50 awards for outstanding contributions to sustainable development and clean capitalism in Canada. Dr. Weaver, I pass you just the next 30 minutes, but they're over to you now.
Thank you very much. And you're absolutely right. I like pointing out to George Heyman that he did indeed win an award on clean capitalism, and he smiles every time I mention it. Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great honor to be able to speak to this regenerative agriculture group. My name's Andrew Weaver. I'm a professor and in the School of Earth and Ocean Sciences. And prior to that, I was, as many of you will know, in the BC legislature as the MLA for Oak Bay Gordon Head and the former leader of the BC Green Party. And before that, I was a Prophet UVic again. What I'm going to talk about here is some of the work I've done in the field of climate science over the last several decades. But I'm going to start by framing what the problem is, and then move to some of the solutions, some of the opportunities, some of the challenges, and kind of where we can go here in British Columbia and to take advantage of some of these. So as we know, the world has warmed. Despite the fact that there are some who believe there's not solid evidence that the world has warmed. In fact, something like 40% of Republicans in the US believe there is not strong evidence that the world has warmed. Akin to saying I don't believe in thermometers. We have ample evidence, and we know for a fact, for example, we know that in the last 6 years, each of those 6 years have been record years. 2020 was the second warmest, 2016 before that, and we expect this to continue in this manner for many, many decades to come. So we know the world's warming. That's fine. What about the state of the climate system? Well, the World Meteorological Organization every year puts out a summary of things that happened in the previous year. So let's take a look at State of the Global Climate 2020. And what it says is that concentrations of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide continued to increase despite the temporary reduction in emissions in 2020 related to measures taken in response to COVID. It also adds on that 2020 was one of the 3 warmest years on record. The past 6 years have been the 6th warmest on yet record. Temperatures reached 36 degrees at I don't see the resolution very well. It's a Verkhoyansk, I believe it is, in Siberia. I've got my other screen up here. It is Verkhoyansk in Russia on June the 20th. That's the highest ever temperature recorded north of the Arctic Circle. We have other things like the trend in sea level is accelerating. We know that ocean heat storage and acidification are increasing and diminishing the capacity of the ocean to moderate climate change with time. We know that the Arctic minimum sea ice extent in September 2020 was the 2nd lowest on record. We know that sea ice in the Laptev Sea is retreated earlier than ever before. Antarctic loss trend is accelerated, and we're losing about 175 to 225 gigatons a year. We know that the North Atlantic hurricane season in 2020 was exceptionally active. That's in La Nina year. We know that hurricanes, extreme heat waves, severe droughts, and on and on and on occurred that year. We know that worldwide there were something like 9.8 million displacements, largely due to hydrometeorological hazards and disasters. And that's only in the first half of 2020. And we know of relevance to everyone here that, in fact, worldwide, disruptions occurred in the agricultural sector. Those disruptions that occurred because of COVID were exacerbated by weather impacts along the entire food supply chain, elevating levels of food insecurity in many parts of the world. So my background is actually one of climate science. What I did over the course of my many decades at UVic was, among other things, develop an Earth system climate model to try to explore some of the feedbacks in the climate system. That is, if we have atmosphere coupled to ocean with complex carbon cycles embedded with them, land surface schemes, vegetation, which is allowed to grow depending on the type of conditions, glaciers and sea ice. We can develop these climate models to use them as laboratories with which to ask what-if questions. And let me give you an example of the type of what-if question that one can ask. Here is a what-if question. This is a what-if about a permafrost carbon feedback. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, we know that permafrost is frozen soils, and if you have frozen soils, you have frozen organic matter, and so that organic matter does not decompose. Let us suppose hypothetically that we turned off all emissions of greenhouse gases in 2013, everywhere in the world. So completely turn them off. We can ask the question, what would happen to the permafrost carbon feedback if effective immediately, or in 2013, every emission of greenhouse gas to the atmosphere was ceased worldwide? Now, we know permafrost, if you unfreeze it, you have organic matter there. And if that organic matter is exposed to oxygen, it can decompose. And in that decomposition process, you produce carbon dioxide. If that organic matter is underwater, say in the bottom of a little lake or something like that, when it decomposes, it's doing so in an anoxic environment and produces methane, both of which are greenhouse gases. And so what we did here was we wanted to get a sense of whether or not the permafrost carbon feedback was self-sustaining or not. And so what we did is looked at a number of scenarios here. This is, I'm showing you this is the type of work that I spent many, many decades working on, well, 3 decades working on before I went into the legislature. We have 3 curves, the dotted curve, the dashed curve, and the solid curve. Now, what these 3 curves represent is pathways of atmospheric carbon dioxide, shown on the left here. That's from 500 to 300 on the bottom. I have to pull my other screen up here because the rating's too small there. Okay, and what we find here is that these three numbers represent three representations of climate sensitivity. Now, what does that mean? By definition, climate sensitivity is the amount the world would warm if we doubled atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. And why I have three values here is because there's some uncertainty in that number. And in fact, we think, based on the very latest IPCC assessment, that it's something of an order between, say, 2.5 and 4 degrees is what climate sensitivity is, with a best estimate of 3. But we don't know exactly what it is, and we won't ever know exactly what it is because there's many, many complex nonlinear feedbacks in the climate system. We can give a range. Climate sensitivity says, how do all the feedbacks in the climate system operate in response to doubling carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, and what is the resulting temperature? Okay, so if we have three climate sensitivities and we turn all emissions off in 2013, we have three pathways. If the climate sensitivity is 3 degrees, we turn all emissions off and atmospheric CO2 remains flat. If the climate sensitivity is 2 degrees, we turn off all emissions and the atmospheric level of carbon dioxide drops. If it's greater than 3 degrees, we turn off all emissions, and even though there is no longer any emission of greenhouse gas from anthropogenic sources to the atmosphere, we continue to raise the levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide. And that is because it turns out that in simulations where the climate sensitivity is greater than 3, the permafrost carbon feedback is actually self-sustaining. So once you trigger it, it just continues and you can't stop it. The good news with that is we have a finite amount of permafrost carbon to actually release in the atmosphere, and it's not of the scale and size that some have argued, and it would likely lead to something like 0.1 to 0.2 degrees additional warming this century. Anyway, these are the type of what-if questions that I've been doing in our lab with students and postdocs over many, many years. I'm going to kind of summarize all climate science now with this figure here, and all the barriers to the implementation of policy with this figure here. This figure is showing 8 panels. The first panels on the left represent the average annual mean temperature from all the models in the globe, all the models around the world that are used to project climate change. So what has happened here is they're all run, and we're showing the average temperature over the decades 2016 to 2035. So all of these show the average temperature from 2016 to 2035 over a number of scenarios of emissions. Oh, in the second column, we're showing the temperature from 2081 to 2100 average, again, for 4 different scenarios of future emissions. What do I mean by that? Well, the top one, this bottom, the bottom path here is basically what we expect the world to do if we follow a relatively green pathway forward in terms of greenhouse gas production. Whereas the top is a much more fossil fuel intensive one. And so let us look at this a little more closely. We see in the first 4, if you look at that, it's really, really difficult to see any differences between those 4 panels. And that's the temperature average over the next decade and a half or so, 2016 to 2035. In all cases, we have about 0.5 degree globally. But now if we look at the other columns, we find 1 degree warmer, 1.8 degree warmer, at the end of the century, 2.2 degrees warmer, and 3.7 degrees warmer. Rather fundamentally different worlds at the latter part of this century, even though in all scenarios we have a very similar trajectory to get that. And that is because the scenarios, they start to differ as you move towards the end of the century in terms of the total emissions. And as a consequence, the climate response at the end of the century is dramatically different. But why this is so important is it basically points to why dealing with this problem is so complex and difficult. Because decisions being made today are not actually going to play out, or the ramifications of those decisions will not play out in the lifetime of those decision makers. With 4-year electoral cycles, you can imagine if you're concerned about continuing with a party in power to govern in another term, you've got to think about putting in place policy measures for which you can point to just before an election, say, look, I listened to you, populace, vote me back in. And that's often why you see people campaigning on reducing hip and knee replacement lineups, because you know 70 to 80% of seniors vote. You know you can throw a bit of money at a problem like that. You can clean up those lineups. You've made a real difference in people's lives. You can point to that in a couple of years and say, vote me back in. With climate policy, because of the socio-economic inertia in our built environment, decisions made today don't actually manifest themselves for many years ahead. And so those making the decisions are really showing bold leadership for which they won't get credit and won't notice a difference in their actual political lifetime. And the reason why, of course, is the whole issue of global warming, and whether or not we should deal with it, in my view, can be boiled down to a single question. Do we, the present generation, owe anything to future generations in terms of the quality of the environment we leave behind? Yes or no? If no, then who cares about global warming? If yes, then we must act today, because the decisions we make today have a profound effect on where the climate system is going to head. And why I say that is, you can imagine you don't build a coal-burning electricity plant today to tear it down tomorrow. The infrastructure that we're building today will last many decades, and that is why the transition from polluting to non-polluting energy systems is so crucial today, so that we're not building more infrastructure to last decades into the future. If we then ask the question, why do I care? Like, who cares about climate change? Well, I would argue that intergenerational equity is an issue that most people care about. Certainly many of the youth today care about. I would argue that widespread species extinction is cared about by an awful lot of people. I mean, this is what we're in store for, is very substantive species extinctions this century all over the world. And we've had other examples in Earth's history where 80–90% of species go extinct as a consequence of a kind of warming and acidity like we're seeing. But also the issue of geopolitical instability, because the seeds have been sowed for discontent around the world by the developed world, who have created the problem. Yet the impacts of the problem that we've created disproportionately manifest themselves on those who actually haven't created the problem, i.e. sub-Saharan Africa and places like that. However, our leaders responded to this crisis. Well, we've known since 1820s that the atmosphere is like a greenhouse, going back to Jean-Baptiste Joseph Fourier. We've had 2 centuries of science, tens of thousands of papers, all saying the same thing. We've had multiple IPCC reports. We've had multiple international agreements. And this is what the emissions have done. And as you can see, they've gone up all the time. We now have on the table something called the Paris Agreement, where the nations around the world have taken steps, they would argue aggressive steps, to hold the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and they've agreed to take steps to pursue limiting it to 1.5 degrees. Well, the reality is the Paris Agreement is destined to be an absolute colossal failure unless, and I think the agricultural sector will resonate with this, unless the issue of border tax adjustments is resolved sooner than later. What do I mean by that? Well, right now, one of the key players is not in the room of the negotiations, and that is the World Trade Organization. Let us suppose that I'm an Okanagan apple grower, and I'm growing apples and harvesting them in the fall. Well, coming up right about now, I start to harvest my apples. But I know there's a market around it, right? I can start selling them straight to the stores now. But I also want to keep some cool for the off season into the spring. So I probably use natural gas as part of my cooling. Now, I know in BC we have an exemption in carbon tax for the greenhouses and so forth. But if you are a Canadian grower of apples and you have to keep them cold till our spring, and you're paying a carbon tax on the natural gas you do to do that. And then along comes New Zealand, who may have gone completely rogue and said, we don't believe in global warming, we're going to use coal power. We've got all these Southern Hemisphere summer, fall apples now. We're going to ship them to Canada. We're not paying a carbon price. Canada's paying a carbon price. Those Fiji apples can undercut the Canadian price. And that is why what we need on the borders is to allow nations to put in carbon tariffs to ensure that those jurisdictions that go rogue or do not put a pricing mechanism on carbon are not do not benefit globally in terms of trade unfairness. The problem is if you put on board tariffs right now, you'll be slapped with anti-dumping lawsuits left, right, and center. And so until we deal with this, and I'm truly hoping that the upcoming COP in November will deal with this, or at least start the pathway, we're going to have problems moving forward. Some of you might have heard about keeping global warming to 1.5 degrees. I'm not even going to show that figure, but I would just say forget about that. I don't know why people are even saying it. It's frankly irresponsible, in my view, to suggest that we can keep warming to 1.5 degrees. We've already warmed by 1.1 degrees. If we do no more than keep existing levels of greenhouse gases fixed at present values, we're going to warm by another 0.6 degrees. That takes us to 1.7. Add a permafrost carbon feedback of 0.1, 0.2. We're at 2 degrees or so, and that's what we're gonna get. So we're almost certainly going to blow by that. And really what we're thinking now, I mean, the honest truth is all hands need to be on deck to prevent 3 degrees warming. And I think, frankly, it's irresponsible when our political leaders use words like 1.5, because we can't. We have simply not got the tools to do that at this stage. And there are certainly not the commitments to do that in light of the feedbacks that we know are in the system. So we got a lot of change in store, and this is going to be quite troubling for quite many sectors. The IPCC, I was involved in many of these. The last IPCC assessment I was involved with was in 2013. This is the 4th one I was involved with. It's a 1,000-page document. You know, I've got the book right here. You can see it. That's one of 3 volumes. So when you see the volume, you can see it's pretty thick. 1,000 pages of science. Not the kind of thing you put on the top of your in your bathroom so you can have a quick read on. It's just not that. It's very dense, very deep. And every 4 years these were being done. You could summarize this 2013 one quite easily. You could just summarize it as saying more of the same with greater certainty. What it said previously in the 2007 report, there's no difference, just more certainty. And if you look at the one that was just released this past August, the 6th assessment report, you know, there's messaging and communications talking about code red for planet Earth, but you can summarize this as even more of the same with even greater certainty. The reality is, as somebody who's been working on these reports since the early 1990s, I couldn't bear being part of another writing session because we know what the problem is, we know what the science is, we know what the solutions are. What's missing has been political will to actually implement the necessary policy measures to deal with this problem. But in dealing with it, and so doing, recognizing the opportunities, particularly in certain sectors that BC's got a lot of strength in, like agriculture, are things we should focus on. We know that the solutions to global warming form in 3 categories. There's the technological, the behavioral, and of course the market instruments. And I'm just going to illustrate very quickly why the market instruments one through the notion of the tragedy of the commons. And I'm doing that because this is an agriculture meeting and there's some cows there. And the tragedy of the commons refers to cows being allowed to graze on crown land in the UK. And we know if cows are grazed on this publicly owned land and a farmer were to ask the question, should I put another cow on this publicly owned land or not? The answer would be yes all the time, because the farmer exclusively reaps the benefits of putting a cow on the land, and any overgrazing effects or costs are distributed amongst all farmers. So the costs of adding a cow to the pasture are distributed amongst all farmers, and the benefits exclusively reaped by one farmer. And so it's always to the farmer's advantage to put a cow on the land. So this farmer's going to want to load the land up with all his or her cows. And guess what? There's only one equilibrium solution. A collapse is inevitable. So how do you stop this? Well, you might elect a benevolent council, and the benevolent council might say, okay, we got to avoid a collapse here. We're going to regulate the number of cows a farmer can put on the land. That's one possibility. We're going to say there can only be 100 cows on this land, and we're going to create a regulatory regime that will divvy up permits in some manner. That's one way. You could cap the number of cows allowed and say, we only allow 100 cows on the land, and we're going to let the market set the price for those cows. We're going to auction off some rights to put a cow on the land, let you guys sell those amongst yourselves. The market will set a price. We're going to have cow certainty, but we're not going to have price certainty. But we can actually control the cows on this because we have a strict cap. Or we could put a head tax on the cow. That is, we could put every cow you put on, it's going to cost you. And while we don't have cow certainty, we have price certainty. We know how much it's going to cost to have a cow on the land, and but we don't know how many cows that will end up. You can control the number of cows with price in number 3, and you control the price in number 2 with the cap. The analogy is direct to carbon pricing, and it's essentially following the economic notion of it, making sure you're internalizing the externalities of your doing business. That is, if I'm a farmer and I'm putting a cow on the land, there's an externality, is I'm affecting others, and I really should pay for that myself. And so I internalize that externality by having a pricing mechanism on putting the cow on the land. And it's the same with the climate system. This is regulation, cap and trade, and carbon tax. In order to internalize the externality associated with using the atmosphere as an unregulated dumping ground, we have some financial tools that we could do here. And again, until we have the border tax adjustments, it'll be slightly complicated to actually efficiently bring down emissions worldwide. Because as it stands, it is in every person, in every house, in every municipality, in every city, in every province, in every country in the world's interest to do absolutely zero about this problem, because the costs of action are borne by the individual, and the costs of inaction are borne by 7 or 8 billion people in the next generation. Mother of all or father of all tragedies of the commons. We know, look what we've done as humans in the last couple of decades. Wireless technology, computers and the internet. We've put men on the moon. We could put women on the moon, but they're too smart to go there, but we've put men on the moon. And I ask you this, are we really as a society not that clever so that we still need to rely on the internal combustion engine? Of course not. The reason why I put that there is suggesting to you that many of the barriers for the introduction of the solutions are not because those solutions don't exist. It's because they push up against vested interests, which have to change. And vested interests often don't want to change. And as such, makes it more difficult to make the transition. In some jurisdictions, for example, change can happen rapidly, like cell phones in Africa or Southern or Eastern Europe or in Asia, where all the little villages out in the mountains, et cetera, did not have telephones because there were no landlines. It was too expensive. But when the wireless technology came in, it didn't have to displace landline technology. It was uptaken rather rapidly. And so this is the problem we see with some of our technology adoptions, is that we're pushing something else out of the market to replace it with a cleaner fuel. That will change with time. Now, I've always argued that climate change is actually the single greatest opportunity for innovation, creativity, and economic prosperity the world has ever seen. And rather than viewing an environmental challenge just as a big problem, it should be seen as an opportunity for innovation. Like, instead of dwelling on the hopelessness of the problem, focus on the excitement of developing solutions. And what do I mean by that? It's an opportunity. Every environmental challenge is like this, whether it be Fairy Creek and cutting down old growth, whether it be, lead in gasoline. Every environmental problem is actually a catalyst for innovation and creativity. And you just have to be careful how you do it. And I'm going to show why with this little, Dr. Seuss series book that you might want to read in your own time. It's a lovely metaphor for a climate change mitigation adaptation. But anyway, there are two opportunities for innovation. We can reduce emissions, or we could create negative emissions. And there's opportunities in the agricultural sector for both of these. We know in British Columbia, our emissions by sector, the biggest piece of the pie, 38% of our emissions comes from transportation, 24% from the fossil fuel industry. And here's agriculture, only 5% of emissions. But there are other areas where agriculture can play an important role. In particular, the generation of renewable natural gas. You'll see that that's coming in to the built infrastructure section here. Let me find, where is that? I have to get it on my other slide here. So the buildings here in number 13, a significant component of that could be reduced through, as I use in my home, the renewable natural gas, which is an agricultural byproduct. It's considered carbon neutral because it came from natural processes. So let's move forward through quickly in the next 5 minutes through British Columbia's climate plan and some opportunities that arise there. Clean BC was kind of the flagship of our confidence and supply agreement. It was an enormous honor to be able to work with the NDP, George Heyman, John Horgan, sorry, I should call him Minister Heyman, the Premier, Minister Popham, and Minister Mungell was the Energy Minister, Minister Ralston. It was a lot of work, but it was very rewarding. And I'm very proud of what we were able to put together. There was a lot of negotiation, a lot of compromise, but a lot of good. And you can see this in your own time, some of the key actions. It's not just one policy measure. It's focusing on things like clean transportation, build the built infrastructure, focusing on industry, carbon capture and storage always makes me feel a bit EBGB, but it's in there. There's a myriad other areas like waste. Waste is another one that's focused on. And so the goal here was a plan was put together with policy measures, regulatory measures, like a big board with switches, with dials, with buttons that can allow you to reduce emissions with all these little regulatory instruments that could guide or send signals to the market as to the direction you wish it to go. Let me move on here to, so there are problems with it, of course, and the federal government, at least the federal Liberal government, has put in a pretty progressive plan too that actually is built on Clean BC and taken it to the other level, is that really, if we want to deal with this climate problem, it is not okay to talk about reducing emissions. We really have to completely eliminate all greenhouse gas emissions, all of them. We have to go to zero emissions because the drawdown times are so long that it's just not, you know, we're not going to be around for the tens of thousands of years it takes to draw down all of the anthropogenic carbon dioxide. The innovation is out there. I mean, we spoke earlier, Clean Energy BC, Clean Energy Canada. There's engineering at UVic, at UBC around the world. There is so much innovation happening in energy systems, the development of smart grid systems. Of course, there's also all these people who complain about smart meters and stuff, but there is advancements. We're going to see very efficient uses of these smart grid systems in years ahead, and I'm quite convinced that BC should and will play a leadership role, particularly with the 203, 204 Indigenous communities whose territory has access to many renewable projects, and I'm hoping that standing offer program continues to advance in the years ahead. So here's a couple of opportunities. Electrification of everything. There's a couple of initiatives that kind of stalled with COVID. I haven't seen those details, but I would argue that there is no room for LNG or any other expansion of any aspect of the fossil fuel infrastructure if we wish to meet BC or international targets. Paris Accord translated means effective immediately, there shall be no new investment in fossil fuel infrastructure, because if you build something, it's going to last 50 years. You can't. So anyone who tells you that we can do this and still meet our targets is not, frankly, telling the truth, because you can't. We must go to zero emissions. It's all hands on deck to save 3 degrees. We did something in BC that I thought was pretty cool. Our electric vehicle ZEV standard is through the roof. British Columbia has done an incredible uptake, highest in Canada, highest in North America, of zero emitting vehicles. And the policy for moving them forward to has just been usurped by the federal government, which went even better than Clean BC, essentially saying that we'll be out of all electric cars by 2040 or 2035, with essentially nothing being sold by the end of this decade. Now, the other opportunity, which is where agriculture could come in, is the notion of negative emissions. And what I've shown here is atmospheric carbon dioxide levels from an ice core taken in Antarctica for 800,000 years. And we're well up above any time that has ever been, at least in several million years. But so the question then comes is, where did that carbon come from? Well, it came from the deep oil and gas and coal reserves, which had sequestered the carbon from the atmosphere over the time frame of tens of million years, from the dinosaur times of the Jurassic, and Cretaceous. And we're putting it back out in a few decades. So we might want to think about putting some of that back. We know that in order to reduce the atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration by 1 part per million per year, we need 4.9 gigatons of negative emissions per year. That's negative half of all total global emissions now. That's to reduce it by 1. So totally, all over the world, we put out about 10 gigatons now up. In order to actually reduce CO2 in the atmosphere by 1 part per million, we need 15 down. We got to take the 10 up out of the card and then 5 more out as well. So we have some work to do here. And because it also, we start to outgas from the ocean as we do this, so it makes it even more complicated. So I'll finish then by saying, in terms of the natural processes, there's a couple of things that are all in early stages. We can either increase natural removal processes or decrease natural emission processes. And the types of things that are being talked about are things like afforestation and reforestation as a means and ways of drawing down carbon. But you have to store it there in perpetuity, so you have to also take steps to make these forests resilient so they don't just burn the next time we get a heat wave. There's a lot of research on the notion of biochar, which is used. It helps moisture retention, but it's also considered a potential negative emission that could be very useful. There's potential capture of carbon in soils through tilling practices, which is an up and coming area of research and in practice in many places. And we have means and steps being taken to try to speed up the so-called weathering process, the natural removal process of carbon dioxide, by sprinkling basalt on fields and things like that. And of course, there's the whole notion of ocean or blue carbon, which is they're trying to use the ocean and carbon there to absorb it. Ocean farming. And I'll skip through that. So I would argue that the international science community has done their job, and now it's time for scientists worldwide to do theirs. And I believe we've actually finally reached a tipping point in public support for substantive action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And I think we saw that last week in Canada's national election, where every party has finished. I see 0-0, I've got 1 slide left. Every party essentially has a climate plan. And thanks to Greta Thunberg and her work bringing awareness worldwide, it's the political establishment that is required to bring in part the policy measures seems to be getting the public support they need to put those measures in place. And for that reason, I'm beginning to get hopeful. But with that said, and to my friends in the activist community, it is not okay to just follow the lead of Homer Simpson's father and shout at the clouds. Governments and policymakers, they're desperate for solutions. Telling people what you don't like is really easy. And you have a duty and a responsibility, if you don't like something, to say what you would do instead and what you would like. And that is one of the things that I tried to do in the legislature. And I think Minister Popham would agree that that was my approach. As a scientist, you tell your grad students, if you don't like their science, fine, criticize it, but you got to tell us what you would do. Otherwise, criticism is cheap and it's not worth the paper it's written on. So that to me is what's missing in public discourse. Is there's far too many people yelling at the clouds saying what they don't like, and not enough people standing up saying what they do like and supporting those who are showing the bold leadership to actually do what needs to be done. And with that, I'll stop and say, what is stopping us? And this is an old slide now, but there's so many co-benefits. It just shocks me that we're not seeing everybody going all in on this problem, because the consequences are very serious. And I truly believe the agriculture sector has an incredibly important role to play in this moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Weaver. It's a very dire message, but I think there's some, as you've said, some tremendous opportunities for the agriculture sector. So let's lighten this up just a tiny little bit, and I think you're in for a real treat.
I thought I was being very positive there. You haven't seen me give the doomy gloomy talk. I could do that one if you want.
I know, and I think this is serious business, and I think you're right. It gets shuffled to the side. So we've got to do some things within this province, and we've got to find ways to do it now. So it was a dire message, but at the same time, I think we're in for a bit of a treat. I'd like to introduce a small video that will will hopefully everybody can sit back and say, wow, what a great young woman. This is a video of Brackenhurst Farm, and our next little segment is with Mickey Aylard. Have a listen.
I've always loved farming. I've always loved being with the animals. I'm the 4th generation to be farming here. My great-grandfather started farming here in 1930, so we've been farming on this land for over 90 years. Here we really are passionate about providing local milk to our community, and we actually take that local product right down to the grassroots level. In fact, the majority of the cow's diet of what they're eating is produced right here on our farm. I see that there's only a finite amount of land that we have, and the population continues to grow, so we need to be able to continue to feed that population. But we're only going to be able to do that by doing it sustainably. I think you really have to use all of the tools that you can in order to have the longevity in the farm. We have robotic milkers, so that means that the cows can get milked whenever they want to be. Each cow has an individual schedule based on her own needs. And so that gives me, as the farmer, a lot more flexibility to take care of those animals in a very individualized way. I'm able to gather a bunch of data that the robot collects and make decisions based on that individual animal. It really improves efficiency, so I'm able to essentially produce more milk with fewer animals. We also have the cows go on pasture, which is actually very good for the land as well, because we actually use rotational grazing. I think there's a huge opportunity for innovation in BC, especially in farming. People that live in BC tend to be first adopters, and they really like to try new things and try new technologies. They're always looking for ways to do things better, that are better for the animals, that are better for sustainability in the environment. For me, our agritech has given me a lot more flexibility in my day. I used to have to milk cows at 4 o'clock in the morning and again at 4 o'clock at night. And now I don't start my day until 6 or 6:30, so that just gives us a lot more flexibility with our agritech. This area behind me has all kinds of Gary oak still in it and a lot of natural habitat which promotes the biodiversity on our farm. It's really important that we have all those good insects and birds and everything around us so that they will actually enhance our own crop production when we're producing food for the cows. I really think that agritech and regenerative agriculture kind of go hand in hand. I think there's so many opportunities to include technology in your farming practices to be more efficient, to produce high quality food, and really to have a sustainable lifestyle and have a sustainable farm. Don't be afraid to try something new and involve agritech in your process, because it's a great tool that we can all use to continue to produce food sustainably in BC.
Thank you very much. That was a fascinating and wonderful little video clip. And Mickey Aylard is going to need a little more time. I think she's going to be having a young one pretty darn soon. So it's pretty neat. Now we're going to move into our designated breakout rooms, and I'd like to introduce both of our moderators for the next section. Dr. Sean Smuckler will be guiding the climate change panel. And Dr. Sean Smuckler is the chair of Agriculture and Environment, the associate professor and associate dean of graduate and postdoctoral studies for the Faculty of Land and Food Systems at the UBC. He leads the Sustainable Agricultural Landscapes in Laboratory, which currently focuses on researching ways to help farmers adapt to climate change and improve sustainability of their farming practices, specifically as they relate to soils. So Liam, and I'm going to introduce the other panel, which is our environmental sustainability panel, Dr. Sylvain Moreno, and he will be guiding us through that particular panel. Dr. Sylvain Moreno is the founder of and scientific director of the Agritech Innovation Sandbox and an associate professor at the School of interactive arts and technology at Simon Fraser University. He is the founder of the Circle Innovation Model and has led several successful national initiatives focused on innovation and authored over 50 scientific publications and patents with real-world impacts.